There is one question human beings have been asking for as long as we have been capable of understanding that we will someday stop asking questions. What happens after death? And I want to begin by taking away the answer you may have been given as a child. Not because it is necessarily false, not because I have some secret knowledge that settles the matter, but because if we are going to ask a scientific question, we have to be willing to put every comforting answer on the table and examine it without protecting it from criticism. Death is not an exotic event. It is happening around us constantly. Cells die, animals die, forests die, stars die, civilizations disappear. Even the atoms in your body have belonged to other things before they belonged to you, and eventually they will belong to something else. Yet your own death feels different. It feels impossible. You can understand, intellectually, that other people die. You can watch a leaf fall from a tree, watch an old dog grow tired, watch a star collapse millions of light years away. But there is a peculiar resistance in the human mind when the sentence changes from "I understand that people die" to "I will die." The first statement is information. The second is a confrontation. And so let us confront it, not with superstition, not with cynicism, not with the smug certainty that sometimes disguises ignorance as intelligence. Let us begin with what we actually know. Your body is a physical system. That is not an insult to you. It is one of the most extraordinary facts about you. You are made of atoms: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, iron, and many other elements in smaller amounts. Those atoms were not manufactured for you. The carbon in your body was forged inside stars. Much of the oxygen around you was produced by earlier generations of stars. The heavier elements were created in violent cosmic events. So before we ever reach the question of what happens after death, we encounter something astonishing. You are already a temporary arrangement of ancient matter. The atoms are old, the arrangement is young, and that distinction is crucial. Imagine a whirlpool in a river. You point to it and say, "There is the whirlpool." You are not wrong. It exists. You can photograph it. You can measure it. You can describe its shape and its speed. But if you scoop up some water from the whirlpool and carry it away, have you carried away the whirlpool? No, because the whirlpool is not the individual molecules of water. It is a pattern maintained by flowing matter. Your body is more complicated, but there is an important similarity. The atoms composing you are continually being exchanged with the environment. You eat them. You drink them. You breathe them. You lose them. Your body maintains a remarkably stable organization while its material components are constantly changing. You are not simply a pile of atoms. You are an organized process occurring in matter. And here is where the question of death becomes much more interesting. If the matter remains, what disappears? The answer, as far as present neuroscience can tell us, is the organized biological activity that makes your conscious life possible. Your heart stops pumping effectively. Blood circulation fails. Oxygen delivery to the brain collapses. Neurons can no longer maintain the electrochemical gradients necessary for normal function. Networks of brain activity break down. Cellular metabolism fails. Eventually, the physical structures required to support those processes become irreversibly damaged. The person does not simply become quiet. The process that was the person has ceased. Now, you may object. You've described the body. You haven't described me exactly. And that is where the hard question begins. What do we mean by me? Is it your body, your memories, your personality, your thoughts? Your capacity to experience color, music, pain, affection, embarrassment, mathematics, or the face of someone you love. Suppose we could replace one neuron in your brain with an artificial component that behaved exactly like the original. Then another, then another. Suppose every replacement preserved every relevant function. At what point would you cease to be you? You might say the answer is obvious, but it isn't. Now suppose I asked you to identify the exact physical location of your sadness. You could point to neural circuits involved in emotional processing. You could measure electrical and chemical activity. You could alter those circuits and change the experience. But there is no little chamber inside the skull where sadness sits waiting for inspection. The brain is not a theater with a tiny spectator sitting somewhere behind the eyes. that old picture is wrong. And this is one of the first assumptions we have to demolish. We often imagine consciousness as something that the brain contains, as if the brain were a box and consciousness were a mysterious substance inside it. But the evidence increasingly points toward consciousness being an activity of the brain, an enormously complicated, dynamically changing process involving interacting networks. That does not solve the mystery. It relocates it to a more precise question. How does physical activity become subjective experience? Why is there something it feels like to be you? Why does a particular arrangement of matter have an interior life? We do not yet have a complete answer. And anyone who tells you that we do should be required to explain exactly what they mean. Now here is where it gets strange. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, and each neuron can form thousands of connections. Signals travel through these networks using electrical changes and chemical messengers. The result is not merely computation in the ordinary sense. It is perception, memory, emotion, language, prediction, attention, and a continually updated model of the world and of the organism occupying it. Change the brain, and you can change the person. Damage certain regions and memories disappear. Damage others and language can be impaired. Alter chemistry and mood can change. Alter sensory input and perception changes. Electrical stimulation can produce sensations, movements, or memories. Anesthetics can dramatically reduce or eliminate conscious experience. The evidence is not perfect, but the relationship is overwhelming. When the brain is irreversibly destroyed, everything we know about consciousness suggests that the individual conscious process ends with it. That is a difficult sentence. But difficult is not the same thing as cruel. Science is not obligated to give us the answer we want. Science is obligated to give us the answer best supported by evidence. And if the evidence is incomplete, science must say so. This matters enormously when we talk about near-death experiences. People sometimes report tunnels, lights, sensations of leaving the body, encounters with deceased relatives, profound peace, panoramic memories, or an overwhelming sense of unity. These experiences can be deeply meaningful. I do not doubt that people have them. The scientific question is different. What causes them? A human brain under extreme physiological stress is not an ordinary brain. Oxygen levels can change. Carbon dioxide levels can change. Blood flow can change. Neurochemical systems can become disrupted. Electrical activity can behave abnormally. Medications, anesthesia, seizures, and other physiological factors can alter perception. A vivid experience is evidence that an experience occurred. It is not automatically evidence that the interpretation attached to that experience is correct. If I dream about flying, I have experienced flying in my mind. That does not establish that my body left the bed. This distinction is not an attack on anyone's experience. It is an act of intellectual respect. If someone's experience matters enough to discuss, it matters enough to investigate carefully. Now imagine a person whose heart has stopped and whose brain function has become severely impaired. Suppose that person later reports seeing events in the room. The obvious question is, when exactly did the experience occur? During complete absence of all brain activity? During a period when some residual activity remained? During recovery, when the brain was reconstructing events from fragmentary sensory information? Could memory have been formed before or after the period of apparent unconsciousness? Those are empirical questions, and they are difficult. The fact that they are difficult does not permit us to replace them with whatever story we prefer. Now here is where it gets strange. We have to talk about information. People often hear that physics says information can never be destroyed, and they leap immediately to a conclusion, then my consciousness must survive death. No, that conclusion does not follow. Information in physics is not the same thing as your autobiographical identity. Suppose I burn a book. The book's pages are destroyed as a readable object. But the physical state of the smoke, ash, gases, radiation, and environment contains an unimaginably complicated record of what happened. In principle, with complete knowledge of the microscopic state and the laws governing it, one could describe correlations tracing back to the original arrangement. But that does not mean the book is still readable. Information preservation is not personal survival. The distinction is essential. The exact arrangement of your brain contains enormous information about your memories, habits, personality, and learned skills. When the brain undergoes irreversible physical destruction, that organization is disrupted. The information does not necessarily vanish in the simplistic sense of being annihilated from the universe, but the structured, accessible pattern that constituted your functioning mind is lost. That is a very different statement. A shattered computer may still contain physical traces of the information that once existed on its disk, but the program no longer runs. And if the program is the process, then the process has ended. This brings us to one of the oldest human intuitions. Perhaps there is something inside us that is not physical, a soul, an immaterial self, something that can exist independently of the brain. Now, science cannot simply declare such a thing impossible. That would go beyond the evidence. But science can ask a brutally simple question. Where is the evidence? If an immaterial consciousness exists independently of the brain, we should expect some way to distinguish that hypothesis from the hypothesis that consciousness depends upon brain function. So far, every reliable line of evidence we have gives us an intimate connection between brain and mind. This does not prove that consciousness cannot exist without a brain. It tells us that we have not established such independent existence. That distinction between not demonstrated and demonstrated impossible is one of the most important habits of scientific thinking. We should be equally suspicious of both extremes. The person who says, "There is definitely an afterlife because I want there to be one," has not done science. But the person who says, "There definitely cannot be anything beyond our current understanding because science has explained everything," has also abandoned science. We have not explained everything. Far from it. And here is where I want to make a confession on behalf of every honest scientist. The unknown is not a defect in the universe. It is a condition of our knowledge. There are questions we have not solved. There are questions we may not even know how to formulate correctly yet. Consciousness is one of them. The ultimate nature of physical reality is another. We do not yet possess a complete theory combining quantum mechanics and gravity. We do not know exactly why the laws of physics have the values they do. We do not know the complete nature of dark matter. We do not know what dark energy fundamentally is. We do not know whether life exists elsewhere in the universe. And we do not possess a final theory of consciousness. That should not make us desperate. It should make us curious. But curiosity requires discipline. You cannot fill an unknown space with any answer you like and call the space solved. Now let us return to death itself. When a human being dies, the atoms do not disappear. The energy does not vanish. The conservation laws remain. The calcium in your bones may eventually enter soil. Carbon may return to the atmosphere. Water may enter rivers, clouds, plants, and oceans. Molecules that were once part of your body may eventually become part of another living organism. In that physical sense, there is no sharp cosmic eraser. The universe does not throw your atoms into a wastebasket, but again, we must be precise. Your atoms surviving is not the same as you surviving. If I dismantle a violin and scatter its wood, glue, strings, and varnish, the materials remain. The music does not. The music existed as an organized process. So did you. And now here is where it gets strange. We tend to think of death as something that happens to life from the outside. But death is woven into life from the beginning. Your cells contain mechanisms for controlled death. Your immune system destroys cells. Your body constantly removes damaged or unnecessary cellular material. Evolution itself depends upon generations replacing generations. Every living thing is temporary. That sounds bleak until you recognize something extraordinary. Temporariness is not the opposite of meaning. It may be one of the conditions that makes meaning possible. A song is not meaningless because it ends. A conversation is not meaningless because eventually the speakers go home. A sunset does not become worthless because darkness follows it. In fact, the finiteness of an event is part of its structure. If human life lasted forever in the literal biological sense, every decision might become indefinitely postponable. Every conversation could be delayed. Every act could wait. Our mortality gives time a direction. That does not mean death is good. Death can be terrible. Premature death can be an unspeakable tragedy. The death of someone you love can fracture the architecture of your life. We should never use philosophical language to pretend otherwise. But we can distinguish between the tragedy of losing someone and the scientific question of what physically happens when the organism can no longer sustain itself. The scientific answer is severe. The biological process ends. The question of whether anything resembling personal consciousness continues remains unestablished. And this is where many people become uncomfortable. They ask, but how can consciousness simply stop? Let us turn the question around. How did consciousness begin? You were not born with a fully formed autobiography. You did not emerge from your mother's womb remembering childhood. Your personality developed. Your memories accumulated. Your language was learned. Your brain changed. Your sense of self changed. If you were unconscious under anesthesia, there may be no continuous conscious experience during that interval. Yet when you awaken, you may say, I was asleep. The sense of a continuous self is powerful. But powerful does not mean metaphysically indivisible. Consider a flame. A candle flame looks like a thing, but it is not a fixed object. Fuel molecules enter. Chemical reactions occur. Heat and light are emitted. New molecules take part in the process. The flame persists as a pattern. Your consciousness may be understood similarly, not as a substance, but as an extraordinarily complex dynamic process. When the conditions supporting the process disappear, the process stops. There is no need for a mysterious substance to escape. The difficult part is that the process is aware of itself. A flame does not wonder whether it will go out. We do. That is one of the peculiar burdens of being human. We know enough about the future to fear it, and yet we do not know enough to see beyond it. Now here's where it gets strange. Imagine that tomorrow we discover overwhelming evidence that consciousness can survive the death of the brain. That would not be a minor scientific footnote. It would be one of the most profound discoveries in human history. But notice what it would require. We would need reproducible evidence. We would need experiments. We would need measurements. We would need alternative explanations eliminated. We would need independent investigators to reproduce the result. We would need to know what exactly survives. Memories? Personality? Self-awareness? The ability to perceive? The ability to communicate? Or merely some unknown physical state that we currently call consciousness because we lack a better word? These distinctions matter. Suppose a perfect copy of you were created after your death, containing all your memories and personality. Would you survive? The copy would insist that it was you. It would remember your childhood. It would recognize your family. It would know your favorite song. But would you experience waking up inside that copy? That is not merely a science fiction puzzle. It exposes something deep about identity. We often assume that continuity of information equals continuity of self, but we have not proved that. Now imagine two identical copies are made. Both have your memories. Both believe they are you. Which one is the real you? If both are equally entitled to the identity you, then identity may not be a simple physical object that can be transferred like a suitcase. Perhaps the self is a process with a history, not a detachable entity. And if that is so, then death may not be a journey from one location to another. It may be the termination of a particular process. That is not comforting, but it is conceptually clean. Science sometimes gives us clarity before it gives us comfort. Now, there is another question. If there is no scientifically established afterlife, why have human beings imagined one in so many cultures? Because we are animals capable of simulation. We can imagine tomorrow. We can imagine places we have never visited. We can imagine other people's minds. And once we understand that a person can die, the mind naturally asks whether death is truly the end. Religions have offered many answers. Some describe resurrection. Some describe reincarnation. Some describe heavens or hells. Some describe cycles of existence. Some describe liberation from individual identity itself. These traditions are enormously diverse. It would be intellectually lazy to dismiss them all with a single sentence. They contain philosophy, ethics, poetry, history, psychology, and attempts to cope with mortality. But a scientific claim requires a different kind of support. A belief can be meaningful without being scientifically demonstrated. That distinction should not frighten us. A poem can tell you something profound about grief without being a neuroscience textbook. A funeral ritual can help people survive the first unbearable hours after loss without providing empirical evidence about an afterlife. Human beings need meaning. Science investigates mechanisms. The two can interact, but they are not interchangeable. Now, here is where it gets strange. Suppose there is no afterlife, not we haven't proved one. Suppose there simply isn't one. Then what? Does your life become meaningless? I would argue the opposite. It becomes more precious. If there is no cosmic guarantee that you will meet everyone again, then the people sitting beside you now matter enormously. If this conversation happens only once, listen carefully. If your childhood happens only once, remember it. If the opportunity to tell someone you love them exists for only a finite number of times, perhaps do not postpone it indefinitely. Mortality can sharpen attention. The knowledge that something will end can make us pay closer attention while it is here. This is not an argument that death is desirable. It is an argument that finiteness does not cancel value. Think about the Earth itself. For most of human history, people imagined the universe as a stage built specifically for us. Then astronomy began pulling the curtain back. Earth is a planet orbiting an ordinary star. Our sun is one star among hundreds of billions in the Milky Way. The Milky Way is one galaxy among perhaps hundreds of billions or more in the observable universe. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Our species occupies an almost absurdly narrow interval within that history. And yet here we are. Matter that spent billions of years moving through stars, oceans, rocks, atmospheres, and living organisms has organized itself into beings capable of asking what happens when the organization ends. That is extraordinary. Not because the universe has promised us immortality, because the universe has produced, at least once, matter capable of contemplating its own existence. Now let us be careful. I am not saying that the universe wanted us. That is anthropomorphic nonsense unless evidence says otherwise. Evolution has no foresight. Physics does not need human intentions. We are here because a long chain of physical and biological processes happen to produce us, and yet the result is remarkable. You can look at the night sky and understand what you are seeing. You can calculate the life cycle of a star. You can determine the chemical composition of a distant planet from its spectrum. You can infer the existence of black holes from their effects. You can reconstruct the history of the universe from faint radiation left over from its earliest observable epochs. And then you can ask whether your own consciousness continues when your brain ceases to function. That question is not small. It sits at the intersection of neuroscience, physics, philosophy, and the deepest human need to understand our place in reality. Now here is where it gets strange. The universe does not appear to contain a special physical law saying, everything important must last forever. Atoms decay. Stars exhaust their fuel. Galaxies evolve. Planets are destroyed. Species disappear. Mountains erode. Even the universe itself may have a future dramatically different from its present state. So why should an individual human consciousness be exempt from the general rule of physical transience? Maybe it is. But if so, we need evidence for the exception. We cannot infer immortality from our desire for it. Desire is not a detector of reality. This is one of the most difficult lessons in science. Nature is under no obligation to conform to our emotional preferences. We may desperately want the universe to guarantee justice. The universe may not. We may want the people we love to remain with us forever. The universe may not provide that. We may want consciousness to be permanent. The universe may not permit it. But there is another possibility that is often overlooked. Perhaps our deepest mistake is asking whether I continue in exactly the same sense after death. The self may be less like a permanent object and more like a temporary pattern. You are not the same physical material you were as a child. You are not even psychologically identical to that child. Yet you inherit a chain of memories, habits, relationships, and biological continuity. Your identity is historical. It has a trajectory. The question of death, therefore, becomes a question about when that trajectory ends. And that may be a more profound question than the image of a soul leaving a body. Because if the self is a process, then we must ask what physical structures are necessary for that process. We can investigate that. We can scan brains. We can record neural activity. We can study patients whose consciousness is altered by injury or disease. We can study sleep. We can study anesthesia. We can study psychedelics. We can study perception and memory. We can build computational models. We can compare conscious states with measurable changes in brain organization. There is no guarantee that these investigations will solve the mystery, but they give us something superstition cannot give us: a path toward being wrong. That is a virtue. A scientific theory must risk failure. If nothing could possibly prove your belief wrong, then your belief may be psychologically important, but it is not functioning as a scientific hypothesis. Now let me tell you something that I think is more unsettling than death. It is possible that we may never completely understand consciousness. Not because consciousness is supernatural, because nature can produce phenomena whose explanation requires conceptual tools we do not yet possess. Before humans understood electromagnetism, electricity and magnetism seemed like unrelated mysteries. Before relativity, space and time were assumed to be fixed backgrounds. Before quantum mechanics, classical physics seemed nearly complete in many domains. Then reality exposed our confidence as premature. So perhaps consciousness will eventually be explained in terms of neuroscience and physics in a way that feels obvious in retrospect. Or perhaps the explanation will require a conceptual revolution. We do not know. And I find that deeply unsettling. But I would rather live with an honest mystery than a comforting fiction. Now here is where it gets strange. The fact that we do not know everything about consciousness does not mean every possibility has equal probability. This is where scientific reasoning becomes uncomfortable. Suppose someone says, maybe consciousness survives death. Fine, maybe. But maybe is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one. Maybe there are undiscovered physical laws. Maybe there are forms of consciousness we do not recognize. Maybe our current concept of individual identity is incomplete. Maybe there is some future theory in which what we call consciousness turns out to have properties we cannot currently imagine. These are legitimate possibilities, but they are not established facts, and we must resist a very human temptation: converting possibility into certainty, because certainty feels better. There is another fact worth considering. Every person who has ever died has left evidence of their existence behind, not necessarily in monuments, sometimes in another person's memory. A sentence they spoke, a kindness they performed, a child they raised, a discovery they made, a piece of music, a scientific idea, a photograph. Changed life. This is not personal immortality in the supernatural sense, but it is causal continuity. The universe remembers events through consequences. A stone thrown into a pond creates waves that travel outward. Eventually, the original wave becomes impossible to distinguish from the countless disturbances around it. But it happened. Your life is like that. You affect other systems. They affect others. The chain continues. You do not need to live forever for your existence to have consequences that extend far beyond your lifetime. That is physics as much as philosophy. Every action changes the physical state of the world. The difficulty is that most of those changes become increasingly dispersed and inaccessible. Your voice becomes vibrations in air. The air molecules collide with other molecules. Energy spreads, heat dissipates. The world changes. The event is not erased, but its organized structure becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct. This is where thermodynamics enters the story. The arrow of time that we experience is closely connected to entropy and the statistical behavior of physical systems. Eggs break more readily than they unbreak. Smoke disperses rather than spontaneously returning to a cigarette. Memory points toward the past, not the future. And death is part of that same irreversible physical world. The organism that once maintained an extraordinary low-entropy organization eventually loses the ability to sustain that organization. The atoms remain. The correlations change. The structure disperses. The process ends. Now imagine standing in a forest after someone you love has died. The trees are still there. The sunlight is still there. Birds continue singing. Children continue laughing somewhere. Cars continue moving. The universe does not stop. This can feel offensive. How can everything continue when someone important is gone? But the indifference of physical processes is not the same as the absence of meaning. The universe does not grieve because grief is a property of conscious organisms. You grieve. And that is significant. Grief is evidence that another person's existence changed the structure of your mind. Their absence is now physically represented in you. Memories are neural patterns. Habits formed around another person can remain. Expectations can remain. The emotional systems they influenced can remain. The person is gone, but their causal imprint continues. That is not an afterlife. It is something stranger and more tangible. It is the persistence of influence. And perhaps we should stop demanding that nature give us immortality in one particular form before we recognize the kinds of continuity it actually gives us. Still, I know what you want to ask. You want to know whether, somewhere beyond the boundary of death, there is still a you experiencing something. I don't know. Neither does anyone else who is being honest. We have hypotheses. We have traditions. We have philosophical arguments. We have extraordinary reports. We have neuroscience. We have physics. But we do not have conclusive evidence establishing personal consciousness after irreversible death. That statement is not a failure. It is the current boundary of knowledge. And boundaries are useful. They tell us where the map ends. The danger begins when someone draws imaginary roads beyond the edge and labels them fact. Now here is where it gets strange. Perhaps the most important question is not what happens after death. Perhaps it is what happens before it. You have this interval. A few decades, perhaps. You did not choose the moment you entered it. You cannot negotiate indefinitely for more time, and you do not know how much remains. That sounds frightening, but consider what it means. Every ordinary moment is occurring inside an event that cannot be repeated. The person sitting next to you will never again be exactly the person they are right now. You will never again be exactly the person you are right now. The atoms change. The memories change. The world changes. And eventually the process stops. That does not make the present worthless. It makes it singular. We often imagine immortality as the ultimate gift, but an endless continuation of consciousness would create problems we rarely consider. Would an immortal mind remain psychologically human after 10,000 years? After 1,000,000? Would memory have to expand indefinitely? Would experiences lose their novelty? Would identity remain stable? Would boredom become a physical condition? Would an immortal individual still care about a conversation begun 500,000 years earlier? We do not know. Perhaps immortality would be wonderful. Perhaps it would be unbearable. The point is that longevity itself is not equivalent to meaning. Meaning is not measured in years. A life can be short and enormously consequential. A life can be long and empty. The metric matters. Now, there is a final misconception we should examine. Some people imagine that if death is the end of consciousness, then from the person's perspective it must feel like eternal darkness. But think carefully. If consciousness ends, there is no observer experiencing the darkness. There is no you sitting in an infinite black room waiting for something to happen. That would still be an experience. Death, if it is the termination of consciousness, is not an experience of non-existence. There is no subject there to experience it. This is difficult for the imagination because imagination always places a conscious observer somewhere. Try to imagine your own non-existence. You cannot quite do it. Every attempt produces a picture in your mind, a dark room, an empty universe, silence. But someone is still watching the dark room. That someone is you. So the mind fails at the task. This is not evidence for an afterlife. It is evidence that the human imagination evolved to model things that exist, not the absence of the modeler. Now suppose death comes and consciousness simply ends. There is no infinite waiting. There is no endless boredom. There is no eternal loneliness. There is simply no experience. Before you were born, you were not sitting somewhere impatiently waiting for your birth. The universe existed for billions of years without your conscious participation. Then, for a brief interval, there was this extraordinary thing called your life. And eventually, perhaps, it ends. That realization can be frightening. But it can also be clarifying. Because the question is no longer, how do I guarantee that I exist forever? It becomes, what will I do with the time in which I exist? That is a much harder question, and a much more useful one. We cannot control the universe. We cannot bargain with entropy. We cannot order the stars to preserve us. We cannot demand that consciousness continue simply because consciousness has become aware of itself. But we can investigate. We can love. We can teach. We can reduce suffering. We can build institutions that outlive us. We can raise children who will see a world we will never see. We can discover things that our ancestors could not imagine. We can leave the universe slightly different from the way we found it. Not immortal, but consequential. And perhaps that is enough. No, perhaps that is not enough for everyone. I understand that. When someone you love dies, no philosophical argument can simply replace them. The empty chair remains empty. The telephone does not ring. The voice is gone. The habits of a shared life become painful reminders. There is no equation that makes grief disappear. Science should never pretend otherwise. But science can give us something else. It can give us a universe larger than our fear. It can show us that the atoms in the person we lost are not gone. It can show us that their life had a physical history, extending backward through generations of stars and forward through the people they changed. It can show us that the world is stranger than the stories we invented to make it comfortable, and sometimes the strange truth is more beautiful than the comforting fiction. Now here is where it gets strange one last time. You are made of matter that has no obvious reason to know that it exists, and yet here you are. You can look backward through time. You can reconstruct the history of the universe. You can understand that the calcium in your bones was produced in ancient stars. You can recognize that the photons entering your eyes may have traveled enormous distances before ending in your retina. You can ask whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent. You can wonder whether the laws of physics are complete. You can fear death. You can know that you fear death. And you can ask what happens when the thing asking the question stops. That is an extraordinary position for a piece of matter to occupy. Perhaps consciousness is entirely a product of the brain. Perhaps future science will reveal something deeper. Perhaps we will discover that our current concept of self is radically incomplete. I don't know. But I know what we must not do. We must not confuse hope with evidence. We must not confuse mystery with proof. We must not confuse an experience with the explanation of that experience. And we must not allow fear of death to become fear of truth. Because if we do that, we lose something far more valuable than the fantasy of immortality. We lose our ability to understand reality. And reality is worth understanding even when it hurts, especially then. Because look at what reality has already given us. A universe billions of years old, stars born and destroyed, planets formed from cosmic debris, chemistry becoming biology, life becoming increasingly complex, brains becoming capable of language, language becoming mathematics, mathematics becoming a tool for discovering galaxies, particles, black holes, and the history of the cosmos, and eventually, somehow, matter became capable of asking whether matter has an inner life. You are part of that story, not the center of it, but part of it. And perhaps there is a strange dignity in recognizing that. When you die, the universe will not hold a memorial service. The galaxies will continue. The stars will continue burning. The planets will continue orbiting. New organisms will be born. Old ones will disappear. The cosmic machinery will continue without consulting us. But for a little while, the universe had you. For a little while, there was a particular arrangement of matter that remembered a childhood, recognized a face, laughed at a joke, felt pain, made mistakes, learned something, loved somebody, looked up at the night sky, and wondered what happens after death. That arrangement may be temporary, but temporary does not mean unreal. A wave is real, even though it eventually collapses. A flame is real, even though it eventually goes out. A life is real, even though it ends. And if consciousness is a process rather than a permanent substance, then perhaps the most honest way to speak of death is not to say that you go somewhere, perhaps you stop. That word is frightening because we are accustomed to imagining every event from inside an experience. But stopping does not require an experience of stopping. The music ends. There is no final note called eternity. There is simply no more music. And that possibility, if it is true, should not make us less alive. It should make us pay attention. Pay attention to the person in front of you. Pay attention to the question you have been postponing. Pay attention to the child who is asking why. Pay attention to the old person who has become invisible to everyone else. Pay attention to the sky. Pay attention to the fact that you are here at all. Because the universe did not owe you consciousness. It did not owe you a childhood. It did not owe you another morning. Every one of those things is temporary. And perhaps that is why they matter. We began with a question. What happens after death? The honest answer is that, as far as science can presently establish, the biological organism ceases to function, the brain loses the activity required for conscious experience, and the individual consciousness appears to end with the irreversible destruction of the brain. We do not have reliable evidence establishing that personal consciousness continues independently after death. But we also have not solved the deepest mystery of consciousness itself. And that unresolved mystery matters. Because perhaps the question we should carry home is not whether death hides another world. Perhaps it is whether we have sufficiently understood this one. We are so eager to know what comes after that, we sometimes forget how astonishing what comes before already is. You are alive, right now. You are sitting inside a universe that is almost unimaginably old, on a small planet around one ordinary star, in one galaxy among an enormous number of galaxies. And somehow, for reasons we are only beginning to understand, this universe has produced a creature capable of looking back at the stars and asking what it means to disappear. That creature is you, and you have very little time. So perhaps do not waste it demanding certainty where there is none. Use it to ask better questions. Use it to test the answers. Use it to love people while they are still here. Use it to learn something that was previously unknown. Use it to leave fewer wounds behind you than you found. And when the final moment eventually comes, if there is no consciousness afterward, then there will be no frightened observer left to complain about it. And if there is something beyond death that our present science cannot yet understand, then we will have discovered that the universe was stranger than we knew. Either way, the proper response is not surrender. It is curiosity. Because the great question is not whether the universe will remember your name. It is whether, while you were here, you were awake enough to look back at the universe and understand what you were seeing. And if someday the last thought disappears, if the final electrical patterns in the brain fall silent and there is no witness left to say, I am still here, then the universe will continue. But before that happens, there is this moment. There is this breath. There is this astonishing fact that you exist at all. So don't ask only what happens after death. Ask the more dangerous question. What are you going to do with the life that exists before it? Because that answer is not written in the stars. It is being written now.